What if the decisive turning points on Ukraine's front lines are not forged by the thunder of artillery or the clash of tanks, but instead unfold far from the gaze of cameras, in the hush of sabotaged railways, in the calculated blackout of cities, and in the psychological games waged from the sky? Imagine for a moment that wars are not always won in the spotlight, but often in the shadows, by those who understand that the mind can sometimes be a more vulnerable target than steel or stone. While headlines chase after dramatic advances, fiery explosions, and the spectacle of missile strikes, a quieter, more relentless struggle is underway beneath the surface. Russian forces have begun using drones not merely as weapons, but as silent couriers of psychological warfare, dropping surrender leaflets directly onto Ukrainian trenches near Kupiansk. These leaflets are not just scraps of paper. They are meticulously crafted tools of intimidation. Each bears a chilling warning. Surrender now. Time is running out. The jaws of encirclement are closing. The message could not be more blunt. Raise your hands or face inevitable destruction. This tactic is not new in warfare, but the method is strikingly modern. During the Second World War, both Axis and Allied forces dropped leaflets from aircraft, hoping to sap the enemy's will. In Vietnam, the United States deployed millions of psychological operations leaflets to demoralize North Vietnamese soldiers. Today, Russia's use of drones to deliver these messages brings this old strategy into the digital age, allowing for pinpoint targeting and repeated psychological bombardment without risking pilots or revealing intentions. Yet these drone-borne ultimatums are only the visible tip of a much deeper, methodical campaign. Russian encirclement tactics are methodically squeezing Ukrainian positions on several fronts, especially around Kupiansk and Krasny Liman. Every day, the ground available to Ukrainian defenders contracts. Supply routes fracture like brittle glass. Lines of communication fray under strain. As the ring tightens, what was once coordinated defense turns to chaos, and fortified strongholds risk becoming isolated, desperate islands in a sea of hostile territory. This approach echoes classic encirclement strategies from history. Consider the Battle of Stalingrad, where the German Sixth Army was surrounded, its lifelines severed, morale shattered long before the final surrender. Or the Siege of Leningrad, where the city's defenders suffered not just from shells, but from hunger, cold, and the gnawing sense that help would never come. Today, modern technology and drone reconnaissance make such sieges more surgical, but the psychological effects remain hauntingly similar. Meanwhile, infrastructure strikes are striking at the very spine of Ukrainian defense. Electricity grids, railway junctions, repair yards, and logistics hubs. When the lights blink out and trains grind to a halt, the consequences go far beyond mere inconvenience. The will to fight erodes, as soldiers and civilians alike are plunged into darkness and uncertainty. The illusion of control slips away. Every blackout and bottleneck is part of a deliberate design to undermine resistance, not just through brute force, but through persistent psychological and systemic attrition. The importance of these infrastructure attacks cannot be overstated. Throughout history, armies have targeted supply lines to cripple their opponents. Napoleon's retreat from Moscow was hastened by scorched earth tactics that left French troops starving and freezing. In the First Gulf War, coalition forces systematically destroyed Iraqi command facilities, power plants, and bridges, crippling their ability to coordinate defense. In Ukraine, the destruction of electricity substations not only shuts down factories and hospitals, but also disrupts internet access, complicates command decisions, and deepens the sense of isolation for frontline units. This struggle, then, is about far more than territory. It is a battle for morale, the invisible fabric that binds a defense together. By targeting both the minds and lifelines of an army, Russian strategy seeks to shatter the mechanisms that make organized resistance possible. If these subtle tactics escape notice, we risk misunderstanding how wars are truly decided, and missing the early signs of shifts that could seal the fate of entire regions before the world even notices. Beneath the surface, these systematic tactics are reshaping Ukraine's ability to fight and survive. To grasp what is really happening at the front, we need to look beyond the daily explosions and trace the hidden currents steering the conflict. Forget the old images of war. No more sweeping columns of tanks, no glorious charges across open fields. Instead, this new conflict is a relentless game of nerves and attrition, waged on power lines, railways, and the battered spirits of soldiers isolated under constant threat. In eastern and southern Ukraine, the fighting is anything but straightforward, and the tactics unfolding are redefining what it means to wage modern war. Kupiansk, Krasny Lyman, and Volchansk have become epicenters, pressure points where multi-directional Russian assaults push from the north, south, and northwest. Ukrainian defenders are threatened with encirclement, forced to abandon continuous lines, and instead split into scattered strongpoints. Every house, intersection, or patch of forest becomes a last-ditch fortress, and the chaos of fragmentation turns resupply and communication into recurring nightmares. For example, in Kupiansk, Russian forces have advanced from several directions simultaneously, using small, flexible units to probe weaknesses and sever roads. Ukrainian supply convoys must now take circuitous routes, often traveling by night or off-road to avoid drone surveillance and artillery. In this environment, even a single destroyed bridge or ambushed convoy can mean the loss of critical ammunition, food, or medical supplies. At the same time, Russian advances in Dnipropetrovsk, Zaporizhzhia, and Kharkiv grind forward, targeting both urban blocks and tangled woods. Gains are measured in meters, not kilometers, but each small advance chips away at the defenders' resolve. The goal is exhaustion, not outright destruction, slowly but surely wearing down Ukrainian lines and eroding their cohesion. This incremental approach echoes the First World War's Western Front, where months of fighting yielded tiny territorial shifts at enormous human cost. In Ukraine, the cost is measured not only in casualties, but in the slow erosion of operational flexibility and the constant stress placed on defenders forced to cover too many fronts with too few men and resources. Yet the real battle stretches far beyond the trenches. Systematic attacks on infrastructure, power stations, railways, repair facilities, cut deeper than even the heaviest artillery. Each strike means more blackouts, more logistical chaos, and a growing sense of abandonment for garrisons severed from support. Damaged grids delay vital supplies, destroyed tracks halt reinforcements, and the uncertainty gnaws at morale as much as dwindling ammunition does. Consider a recent strike on a regional power substation in Kharkiv. Not only did electricity blink out for tens of thousands of residents, but command posts lost reliable communications, and hospitals were forced to rely on dwindling reserves of fuel for generators. Railway traffic halted, leaving wounded soldiers stranded in field hospitals and delaying the arrival of reinforcements by many precious hours. The cumulative effect is a creeping paralysis, each new disruption compounding the last, until even the best-trained units find themselves overwhelmed by logistical nightmares. There is no single, decisive clash, only a campaign of attrition, disruption, and psychological pressure. Drones drop leaflets urging surrender, while supply lines thin and the threat of encirclement grows ever more real. Traditional rules no longer apply. The war is fought as much within the minds of defenders as in the battered earth beneath them. Failing to recognize this evolving reality risks misunderstanding the slow, grinding shifts of the front lines, and why whole garrisons can suddenly collapse. The war of nerves and supply is just the beginning. What Ukraine now faces is a tightening web of layered pressures, closing in with each passing day. As the campaign grows more complex, every decision and delay carries outsized consequences. The next phase will reveal whether Ukraine can adapt to this relentless onslaught, or if the pressure will finally break their lines. What if a fortress is not shattered by bombs and bullets, but is instead strangled by silence? This is no longer a theoretical question in eastern and southern Ukraine. It is the blueprint now determining the fate of entire garrisons. Picture this. Leaflets, dropped not by hand but by drone, flutter down onto surrounded positions. Each slip bears a chilling message: surrender swiftly or face certain destruction. For soldiers encircled on three sides, the threat is immediate. The real terror comes not from the roar of an assault, but from the creeping fear that rescue will never arrive. Behind the front, war unfolds in shadows. Russian forces target infrastructure with methodical precision. Power grids flicker out, rail lines are crippled, and communication becomes a gamble. Each strike does more than halt reinforcements. It breeds uncertainty, making every trench feel isolated, every command post exposed. Guided munitions and painstaking intelligence allow for surgical strikes. Logistics hubs and military factories, like the massive Yuzhmash complex, once a hub for missile production, become prime targets. Each successful hit chips away at Ukraine's ability to fight not only today's battle, but tomorrow's as well. Replacing a destroyed transformer or repairing a blown railway bridge can take weeks or months, stretching thin the already limited engineering resources available. Encirclement in this war is often partial, but just as deadly. Even a loose ring can choke off supplies, disrupt command structures, and sow doubt. For defenders, the realization that escape is unlikely and relief will not come can erode morale faster than any shelling. Psychological pressure mounts, sometimes fracturing resolve before the enemy even draws near. Drones such as the Italmaz or Orlan loiter overhead day and night, collecting real-time intelligence and executing pinpoint strikes. Their constant presence means Russian troops can keep the pressure on without exposing themselves to high risks. For those trapped below, it means feeling hunted, watched every hour, cut off from help, confidence draining away. Some reports tell of Ukrainian soldiers rationing batteries for radios, unable to call for help or coordinate with neighboring units, as enemy drones circle silently above. Analysts now see a deliberate three-part strategy. First, expand territorial control to threaten from multiple directions. Second, isolate Ukrainian resistance into vulnerable pockets. Third, unleash psychological operations to sap morale. This triad, physical isolation, logistical breakdown, and mental strain, operates in tandem, tightening the grip. If Ukrainian defenders cannot adapt to this evolving hybrid siege, their strongholds risk falling from within, often before a single wall is breached. Collapse arrives not with a thunderous assault, but with the slow, relentless tightening of isolation. This is the siege of the 21st century, not a ring of cannons, but a web of drones, psychological pressure, and logistical strangulation. Yet even as these tactics close the vice, the situation on the ground remains fluid. Ukrainian commanders are searching for new ways to break the cycle and regain the initiative. Some have adopted tactics from Israel's experience under siege, using small mobile units to harass besieging forces, building redundant supply caches, and developing secure low-tech communication methods to bypass electronic jamming. Others look to the lessons of the Yugoslav wars, where determined defenders sometimes broke out of encirclement by exploiting enemy overconfidence or bad weather. If current patterns intensify, entire regions may not collapse in fire and noise, but instead succumb to silence, a blackout, a whisper, and then nothing. The fall of Mariupol in the early stages of the conflict stands as a sobering precedent. Weeks of bombardment followed by encirclement, loss of electricity and water, and finally, the forced surrender of exhausted, isolated defenders. The echoes of that tragedy now threaten to repeat elsewhere. Let us envision where Russia's escalating tactics could lead if left unchecked. Picture cities such as Kupiansk or Pokrovsk, already scarred by constant strikes on power grids and water systems, plunged into the heart of winter without electricity, running water, or functioning communications. Hospitals shudder into darkness, backup batteries drain, and defenders, cut off from relief, find hope slipping away. Residents huddle in basements, food supplies dwindle, and the city's defenders face the agonizing choice between surrender, breakout, or a last stand. Once key supply routes are severed, Ukrainian forces risk being surrounded, their link to the outside world growing thinner with every passing day. What starts as a precarious foothold could rapidly unravel into complete isolation. In these dire circumstances, garrisons confront agonizing choices: gamble on a breakout, risk a desperate retreat, or surrender en masse. Psychological warfare, drones dropping leaflets, relentless propaganda, seeps into the cracks, eroding resolve from within. Urban combat under such pressure rarely holds firm. Instead, resistance splinters into scattered pockets, small islands of defenders, each with scant hope of reinforcement. The attack on Sumy foreshadowed this pattern. First, targeted bombardment and encirclement, then tight deadlines for capitulation. Drones delivered ultimatums from above, sowing confusion and dread. This template could easily be repeated, threatening to turn more cities into cautionary tales. If morale fractures and coordination falters, Russian troops could seize significant ground while limiting their own casualties. For Ukraine, each lost city would mean not only territory, but a dwindling ability to regroup, rotate exhausted units, or deliver vital supplies. Supply lines would be stretched thin, perhaps to the point of snapping, slowing or stalling reinforcements entirely. The suffering would not stop with the military. Prolonged blackouts and shattered water mains would endanger entire civilian populations, unleashing humanitarian crises with ripple effects far from the front. Each city lost in this way would strain Ukraine's war effort and place new burdens on its international partners. Relief convoys would face new risks from mines, drone attacks, and damaged infrastructure, while refugees would flood already crowded border crossings, seeking safety and warmth. To ignore this trajectory is to underestimate the threat of sudden, sweeping losses and a wave of humanitarian emergencies radiating outward from the conflict. The stakes are not just tactical, but profoundly human and strategic. The collapse of a single city could trigger a domino effect, undermining morale across the country and forcing Ukraine's allies to confront difficult choices about aid and intervention. This escalating pattern demands urgent attention. What then can be done to disrupt it before the consequences become irreversible? If tomorrow's front lines are shaped by invisible wars, how do you shield yourself from threats you cannot see or touch? The first step is to understand that defense must evolve. Today's military leaders face challenges that are decentralized, layered, and deeply psychological. This makes backup logistics and seamless coordination more vital than ever. Classic command systems are under siege from sudden strikes on supply lines, communications blackouts, and relentless information attacks. Rigid hierarchies crack under pressure, while adaptable, decentralized leadership and redundant routes are quickly becoming the foundation of survival. Psychological warfare is now constant. Direct, transparent communication with troops helps counter enemy propaganda designed to spread fear, doubt, or confusion. Historical examples abound. During the siege of Sarajevo in the 90s, defenders survived in part by organizing decentralized networks of supply tunnels and radio relays, keeping vital lines open even when the city was surrounded. In Afghanistan, resistance forces often used informal village networks to bypass Taliban blockades, ensuring the flow of food, medicine, and information. These lessons remind us that flexibility and redundancy can make the difference between collapse and endurance. No one remains untouched. Blackouts, food shortages, and information manipulation can strike communities without warning. Civilians and support workers must have plans for power loss, supply disruptions, or waves of false news. Ordinary citizens, when trained to spot and respond to these threats, can reduce panic and keep essential systems running during sudden crises. Community resilience, fostered by regular drills, information-sharing networks, and mutual aid agreements, can blunt the impact of enemy efforts to sow chaos and despair. For analysts or the public, focusing only on explosions, battles, or shifting map lines misses the hidden engines of conflict. The slow grind of infrastructure sabotage, logistical isolation, and psychological pressure can decide outcomes long before open fighting erupts. Understanding these quiet tactics is as crucial as following the headlines. Learning how these methods work does more than refine military planning. It lets leaders predict enemy moves, ensures humanitarian aid reaches those in need, and helps citizens read the news with sharper, more critical eyes. The hybrid warfare model now emerging, fusing physical sabotage, resource isolation, and psychological operations, could define wars far beyond Ukraine's borders. Already, analysts warn that similar tactics could be used in other conflicts, from the South China Sea to the Middle East, wherever infrastructure and morale are vulnerable. Those who adapt, militaries, governments, or everyday people, stand a far greater chance of surviving and shaping events. Ignoring these lessons risks rapid, irreversible losses, leaving no time to react or recover. So what should you actually watch for? And what can you do, starting today? First, pay close attention to patterns of infrastructure sabotage. When a power substation goes down or a railway bridge is destroyed, ask what supply lines are affected and who stands to benefit. Look for signs of coordinated propaganda, waves of surrender leaflets, sudden spikes in rumors or panic-inducing news, or social media campaigns aimed at undermining trust in local authorities. Track the tempo of drone activity, as persistent overhead surveillance often precedes fresh offensives or psychological operations. Second, advocate for and support efforts to build redundancy and resilience at every level. For communities, this might mean investing in backup generators, stocking emergency supplies, and creating neighborhood watch groups to counter disinformation. For militaries, it means training leaders to operate independently under blackout conditions, setting up alternate lines of communication, and pre-positioning supplies in secret caches. For governments, it means strengthening cyber defenses and launching public information campaigns to inoculate citizens against enemy propaganda. Third, demand transparency and critical analysis from media and officials. Do not take reports at face value. Instead, seek out sources that explain the underlying tactics and connect the dots between seemingly unrelated events. When a city goes dark or a unit surrenders unexpectedly, ask what pressures may have been building behind the scenes: logistical, psychological, or both. Finally, prepare yourself mentally for the possibility that the next decisive moment in this conflict, or in any future conflict, may not come with a bang, but with a whisper. Train yourself to recognize the signs of creeping isolation, the slow tightening of supply lines, and the subtle erosion of morale. In a world where wars are increasingly fought in the shadows, the ability to anticipate and adapt to silent threats is as valuable as any weapon or fortification. The next chapter explores how these silent, systematic tactics are playing out across Ukraine's eastern and southern front lines. What happens when the battle is fought as much in mines and supply routes as in trenches and ruined cities? The next turning point might not scream from headlines, but instead creep in with the hush of a city plunged into darkness. Imagine waking up not to the sound of gunfire, but to the eerie silence of a powerless city. Streetlights off, phones dead, trains motionless. In that silence, the fate of armies and nations may be decided. This struggle is not only about thunderous blasts or dramatic charges. It is defined by quiet, relentless moves, rarely the subject of breaking news, but no less decisive. Power grids flicker out, railway lines freeze, and suddenly, entire cities find themselves isolated, unable to call for help or restock their shelves. These are the true engines of change: patient strikes against infrastructure, unrelenting psychological pressure, slow encirclement. Each silent action chips away at the defender's strength. A bridge lost here, a network severed there, weakening resolve before the world even suspects a shift. If you watch only for sweeping offensives or iconic battles, you risk missing the subtle patterns that truly determine the war's direction. The balance tips not just through firepower, but through the steady, almost invisible campaign of cutting supplies, sowing doubt, and draining energy. To stay genuinely informed, look beyond headlines. Ask which substations failed, which roads disappeared, which neighborhoods fell eerily silent. Seek out those who connect these quiet clues, rather than just echoing the chaos at the front. Because the cost of being blindsided is not just your own confusion, it is a danger to whole cities and to the stability of nations. When the lights vanish in a single region, the consequences can ripple far beyond any single front line. Watch for the silent shifts, the tightening of supply lines, the steady advance of exhaustion, the anonymous warnings from quiet drones overhead. This is how the front truly changes, and how you can avoid being surprised by what comes next.